Cheers! Welcome to Adaptable,
the show where we compare books to their movie adaptations.
I'm Paige.
I'm Emily.
And today we're going to be comparing
Pride and Prejudice. Before we get to the debate, let's talk plot.
And warning, if somehow in the last 200 years you've missed this classic plot, we're going to spoil it for you now.
The story centers on the Bennet family with its 5 unwed daughters, most keenly Elizabeth Bennet and her older, lovely sister, Jane Bennet.
This family is in a particularly odd place in 1800 society. They are not quite high class, filthy rich, but they're rich enough where they're not working class either. On top of this, they don't have any sons, which means any wealth they do have is going to be passed off to a distant cousin.
Instead of the daughters, so it's very important that they all get married off as quickly as possible, at least according to their very desperate mother, Mrs. Bennet.
Enter new gentlemen into the neighborhood, Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley, both very wealthy.
Mr. Bingley is the talk of the town. He's sweet, he's charming, he's rich. Mr. Darcy's a bit of a pill.
He's also the talk of the town for being stubborn, arrogant, and antisocial.
Yep, and when a soldier named Wickham enters the scene and befriends the Bennet family, he tells the tale of how Darcy once cheated him out of his rightful inheritance, and this casts Darcy as an even greater villain.
On top of Darcy not being willing to dance with our Elizabeth Bennet.
Which just makes him a scoundrel, at least according to the women of the town.
Lizzie and Darcy are not getting along. However, Jane and Mr. Bingley are.
Particularly according to Mrs. Bennet.
Yes.
She expects wedding bells any day, which makes it especially heartbreaking when Mr. Bingley up and moves suddenly without so much as a word to Jane. Elizabeth suspects Mr. Darcy is behind it all. Elizabeth, meanwhile, goes to visit one of her friends who happens to be staying at the estate of Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who is the aunt, of course, of Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth unfortunately runs into Mr. Darcy, who has the audacity to have fallen in love with her, and proposes, which she soundly rejects, much to his surprise.
She hurries back home, but she also gets a letter from Mr. Darcy, in which we learn that Mr. Darcy indeed was in fault in separating Bingley and Jane. We also learn that Mr. Wickham is not the gentleman he pretends to be.
Mr. Wickham has lied about Mr. Darcy's role in the loss of his inheritance, and Mr. Bingley was separated from Jane because Mr. Darcy believed, incorrectly, that Jane didn't really care about Bingley. He is still proud and kind of unpleasant, but not after all a villain.
After Lizzie goes home, she chooses not to share any particulars about Wickham with the town, since he was going to be leaving soon anyway.
Also, Lizzie's not hanging about long either. Her aunt and uncle invite her on a tour of the country that includes, where else but Pemberley, the estate of Mr. Darcy.
She stumbles across Mr. Darcy at his home, shocker. She is surprised, horrified, and chagrined, but also this gentleman's arrogance seems to have gone away.
She's surprised, chagrined, and a little turned on.
As they start to make a friendship,
Elizabeth receives another letter, this time from her sister Jane, explaining that Lydia Bennet, the youngest and most reckless of the Bennet sisters, has run away with none other than Mr. Wickham. Elizabeth returns home to a distraught family, and Mr. Darcy, unknown to Elizabeth, goes and finds Wickham and Lydia, insists they marry, and saves the honor of the Bennet family. A few weeks pass, and Mr. Bingley returns to the hometown of the Bennets, proposes to Jane, and Elizabeth correctly assumes it is at Mr. Darcy's urging.
At that point, Mr. Darcy also comes back into the neighborhood. Lizzie, understanding his true heart, has softened considerably.
So when he proposes for the second time, she says yes. And everybody who deserves to lives happily ever after.
This is the original enemies to lovers romance, and Jane Austen does not disappoint.
Today, we'll be comparing this classic novel against
the 1995 BBC miniseries.
But since the novel came just a wee bit sooner than the miniseries. I'll go first. Bring my cup back. For my first point, the plot of Pride and Prejudice might be popular, but make no mistake, it's Jane Austen's writing that made the book legendary. Specifically, the ambiguity Jane Austen brings to the text. She writes in a style known as free and indirect discourse. This means no chapter is told exclusively from one character's point of view. It's all in the third person, but it might move from Darcy's point of view to the narrator's to Elizabeth's. And this leads to ambiguity whether something is a character's thoughts or the narrator stating something as a matter of fact. One of the subplots in the novel surrounds Elizabeth's best friend Charlotte, who marries a foolish but wealthy enough to grant security suitor named Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins is the object of ridicule, and Elizabeth cannot imagine that Charlotte could have any sort of happy or dignified life as his wife. When she goes to visit Charlotte, she sees that she's been somewhat incorrect. Charlotte has made a really lovely life for herself. And the book describes it as follows. Poor Charlotte. It was melancholy to leave her to such society, but she had chosen it with her eyes open, and though evidently regretting that her visitors were to go, she did not seem to ask for compassion. Her home and her housekeeping, her parish and her poultry, and all their dependent concerns had not yet lost their charms. On its own, that doesn't seem like a particularly dramatic phrase, except we don't know whether it's Elizabeth thinking it or the narrator commenting it. If it's Elizabeth's comments, well then it's just her continuing to express concern about whether or not Charlotte can be happy. If it's the narrator saying that Charlotte's life has not yet lost its charms, the narrator is then condemning Charlotte's future to be an unhappy one. It's a reveal that Charlotte will ultimately be unhappy for her choice. The novel on the whole doesn't seem to condemn Charlotte, nor does it celebrate her. The ambiguity is intentional, and because this is a social commentary on people's emotions, that ambiguity is really vital to the complexity that makes Pride and Prejudice what it is. For my second point, I will admit the BBC adaptation is lovely. That's largely because it's almost a carbon copy of the book, so most of its strengths it draws directly from the book. And what it does do by itself are some weird choices. Like Mr. Darcy jumping in a pond, or the bathroom bathing scene with Mr. Darcy. A lot of people will even argue, well, no, it's like a little sexy add-on, except they're not even particularly effective sexy scenes. They're just weird moments that got inserted into the plot needlessly, and it's not like the BBC miniseries needed to pad the runtime. You can read the book in the time it takes you to watch the miniseries. So I question how much stronger of an adaptation the BBC series can be with so much extraneous material. Finally, letters are really important in Jane Austen's novels. She wrote 6 novels in her lifetime, and all of them keenly feature someone writing important information, sending letters to someone else. In Pride and Prejudice, there's at least 3 very critical letters that get exchanged. And any visual medium, any movie adaptation, finds themselves in kind of the awkward situation that letter reading is kind of a hard thing to put on screen. Like, you either have to have someone read a letter out loud to themselves, or you have to use voiceover, and then it's voiceover over an image of someone reading a letter or cutting away to other things to try and liven up a letter reading scene. That awkwardness does not exist in the original novel because you're reading things anyway. You get to read the letter with the characters. So these really critical pieces of information run much more smoothly in the plot. The novel is just a much less awkward affair.
You're an awkward affair.
That was rude.
For my first point, the BBC Pride and Prejudice brings this novel to life while keeping Jane Austen's language. Jane Austen was a master of the written word. You can see in the BBC version a lot of the dialogue is almost word for word from the novel, keeping not only the time period alive, but also keeping Jane Austen's wit and cleverness alive. We also see this in different ways in the book in some of the more active scenes. For example, the famous dance scene at Pemberley, you can write about and you can explain a dance, but the tension of the dance, the way the characters interact with coming together and then coming apart, it's all well and good on pages of a book, but when you get it to visually see the dance and hear the music, it just comes to life. Number 2, the visuals in this BBC adaptation are stunning. The hair, the makeup, the costumes, it looks like you stepped out in 1810. We did not cut corners, we did not try to modernize anything in this adaptation. It is a true adaptation of history, which is just a very beautiful thing and not something that a lot of movies do very well. And number 3, and in my mind, the most important reason I fell in love with this BBC version, the BBC version gives us Darcy's perspective in a really unique way that lets us truly see into who his character is in a way that is in keeping with Jane Austen's novel, but gives us more depth than her novel actually does. For example, when Darcy gives his famous letter to Elizabeth, in the movie, we get to hear not only Elizabeth's thoughts as she's reading it, it's read in Darcy's voice and we get his perspective as he's writing it. We get to see more of that inner turmoil that the book leaves us silent on. For the extraneous scenes that Emily mentioned, they also give us more perspective into who he is. The bathing scene is not important because of the bath, rather it's important because you see an unguarded moment where Lizzie is playing with a dog down below and Darcy is not this stitched and proper gentleman. We also see the diving scene where again we get to see a little bit more of who Darcy is as a person, not just a high society peer, and then we watch him frantically change into clean clothing so he can chase after Elizabeth. These pieces help humanize Darcy in a way that we don't get in the book. Is this adaptation long? Absolutely. Awkward? I think not.
Hold this. Thank you. Okay. First of all, almost every strength you mentioned in the BBC miniseries is about how it did a good job of justifying its existence for this moment of the book. But none of it really elevates it. Almost all of it is, oh, thank goodness someone found a way to make Jane Austen's words work on screen, but it's an equal, not a surpassing of any moment.
I would say that putting Jane Austen's work on stage faithfully is what any good adaptation should do, and this does it beautifully.
Disagree. Boring. There are other adaptations of Pride and Prejudice that are absolute trash, but at least a lot of those have the decency to be courageous trash, adventurous, trying something new. The BBC miniseries isn't terrible compared to the book, but that's because it's literally almost exactly the book just put on screen. It doesn't cut anything, it doesn't really heighten anything, it's just this thing that you pictured in your head, well, there it is on screen. No real alteration, but no real advantage with that either.
I would say your argument is what makes this adaptation so good, is that we get a clean adaptation where someone didn't try to toss romantic fantasy into it.
Clean,
Bridget Jane.
sanitized, safe,
Elegant.
dull.
We get the feeling of 1810. 1810 was not a trashy romance novel. I'm sorry, there was no rain in a gazebo happening with proposals. And we get that feeling. We get, honestly, some of the boringness of what life was like for the women by having this longer form video.
But all it does is just recreate what's in the book. It's kind of like, if that's what you want, go read the book. It's better. It's more engaging. You get all of Jane Austen's wit, not just the character dialogue, which is largely preserved in the series, but also the narrator's irony and the fun depictions of the characters. Like Mr. Collins, the absolutely ridiculousness of Mr. Collins as the narrator describes his pathetic and annoying attempts to ingratiate himself into society. That you get some of the actors kind of assuming it, but it is not nearly as funny as the book's depictions. The BBC miniseries attempts what the novel has already mastered.
I would say in some ways, you are right, that there is some narrator pieces that we lose. However, I think personally that the gains we get from some of the ways they are courageous and they do expand on some character development, especially with Mr. Darcy, as well as the visuals that we get of some of those places of higher tension, not the letters per se.
I mean, we certainly get more visuals of Mr. Darcy.
I was talking about the dance, dear, as well as some of the other pieces. Again, we get that feeling of maybe even as viewers being bored, because there were times they were bored. but we also get the view
Just
of
quick,
the
just quick pause. Your selling point for the series is sometimes you'll feel as bored as the characters are.
Is that not what we want if we're adapting?
No, because we're not adapting the historical moment. We're adopting Jane Austen's narrative, which, yes, has quieter moments, but even those tend to be moments of introspection, never boredom.
I
the
disagree.
BBC
there are
series-
times in the book that those characters are bored.
Yeah, but it's entertaining to see them be bored. We are not bored with them, which the BBC series pushes into.
I don't think it does.
I will grant the series does have one lovely addition, and that comes at the end of the bit. Jane Austen's novel ends a bit abruptly. It's not horrible, but it does kind of wrap up the plot and it's done. The BBC series doesn't end at the proposal of Mr. Darcy, it ends at the wedding. It's a double wedding with Jane and Bingley and Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth, and as the wedding vows are read in the ceremony, it spans over all of the married couples in the series. From Colin and Charlotte's kind of marriage of security, to the genuinely loving marriages of the aunt and uncle, to the awkward marriage of the Bennets, which has its ups and downs. And it does paint a whole visual picture of what marriage can be, especially in this time when economics is such a strong motivator for marriage. And I like that moment. That moment is good. But those moments are kind of rare in it. It's mostly just a visual depiction of what's already in the novel. It doesn't take a step beyond the story. It's just too safe. Never bad, never terrible, always good, but never masterful.
I love this movie so much. However, it's hard to compete with the original source material with Jane Austen. I'll give you that.
She'd be proud of your magnanimity. Thank you so much for following our debate. Feel free to join it in the comments below.
This has been
Adaptable.